And we're now live.
Okay, thank you and good evening to everybody. I would like to welcome everyone to this public virtual meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission. Please note that the meeting is being broadcast and recorded. We move on to agenda item 1, which is apologies for absence. Kirsty, do you have any?
Yes, Chair. We have received apologies from Councillor Mackenzie Boyle.
Okay. No other apologies?
No.
Members of the Commission, please turn on your microphones and confirm you are present only when Kirsty calls your name. Anyone who does not respond will be recorded as giving their apologies. I know there are some members present who are not members of the Commission, so Kirsty, you'll need to collect them up as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chair. When I call your name, please can you say that you're in attendance? Councillor Angel.
Present.
Councillor Virgo.
Present.
Councillor Mrs. Birch.
Present.
Councillor Brossard. Councillor Brossard. I'll come back. Councillor Badebo.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor McLean.
Present.
Councillor Mattich.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Mossam.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Porter.
Present.
Councillor Temperton.
Present.
Okay. Councillor Tullett.
Present.
Thank you. And our parent governors are Tracy Wright.
Present.
And Mark Glanville.
Present.
Thank you. I will come back to Councillor Brossard. Is Councillor Brossard here? No? Okay, thank you. Are there any other participants in attendance that would like me to be aware of their presence? Please speak now.
Councillor Pauline Mackenzie.
Thank you.
Councillor Harrison.
And Councillor Tricia Brown.
Lovely. I have Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Harrison and Councillor Patricia Brown. Is that it? Anyone else like to indicate their presence? Councillor Barnard, are you attending?
Hang on. Yes, I am.
Lovely. Thanks, Councillor Barnard. Thanks, Chair. That's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, just going back there, Kirsty, I thought I heard somebody say that Councillor Ingham was present. Did she record it or is she not?
Hello, Robert. Yes, I'm present. My connection keeps failing, so I've come back in. Thank you.
Okay, good. So that's recorded.
Councillor, can I just ask if Councillor Kirk is present as well, please?
Councillor Kirk, are you present? He was on the participants list.
Okay.
Could I just say, this is Councillor Jill Birch here. Councillor Dale Birch, executive member, he's trying to get on and he can't seem to get on. Wonder if someone can help him. Kirsty.
Thank you for notifying us, Jill. Chair, that's
I
item
will
2.
provide some support. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, to move on to item 2, which is the minutes of the meeting of the 15th of September. Before I move that they are accepted, please indicate in the meeting's chat if you have an issue with the accuracy. Okay. I think nobody putting forward anything. Councillor Virgo, are you happy to second their acceptance?
Yes, Chairman. Happy to second.
Thank you. Councillor, nobody has indicated that they have any issue, therefore I take those as agreed. Thank you. Next item is agenda item 3, declarations of interest from the party whip. The full text of declarations of interest is set out on the agenda at item 3. If any councillors have a disclosable pecuniary interest or an affected interest to declare, please indicate in the meetings chat and I will come to you in turn. Okay, there is no...
Chairman, sorry, I apologise. I put my hand up saying I wanted to speak. Councillor Jill Birch, if Councillor Dale Birch does get on, I declare an interest because he's executive member for adult social care and housing.
Okay, Jill, thank you for that. Are there any other declarations? No, okay, thank you. The fourth item on the agenda tonight is urgent items of business. Are there any? Kirsty, we have no...
Sorry, no, Chairman, I'm not aware of any.
Okay, thank you. Then we move on to item 5, public participation. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak?
Chairman, I'm not aware of any questions from the public that have been submitted to the committee Dropbox. However, please can I just confirm, Councillor Kirk is present but can't actually speak. He is listening though, and Councillor Birch is also present now.
Okay, fine. Then we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 6, community safety. We're now meeting as the Crime and Disorder Committee and will receive a presentation on the performance of the Community Safety Partnership and the priorities in the Community Safety Plan for the coming year. So welcome to our Chief Executive, Tim Whedon. Welcome to Felicity Parker, our local police commander for Bracknell and Wokingham, and Alison O'Meara, Head of Community Safety. Welcome to you all and thanks for coming along. It's an annual event, I believe, and it doesn't seem a year since you were last here, but anyway, thank you again for your presentation and your time. Over to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I chair the Community Safety Partnership, but I'm mindful of the time constraints you've got this evening, and the people who do the work are Alison O'Meara, Head of Community Safety, and Superintendent Felicity Parker. So I'll just hand straight over to Alison and then Felicity to run the presentation, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I'm just going to quickly share the screen, so bear with me a second while I just get the presentation loaded.
Alison, just while you're doing that,
yes,
I just want to make it clear that you don't need to go at 90 miles an hour.
okay.
You know, don't feel restrained quite as tight as that. Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Can I just check that everyone can see the presentation and can also hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, good evening to you all, and thank you for your attendance this evening. This presentation is a look back at CSP performance over the last 1.5 years, actually. Councillor Angel mentioned that it doesn't feel like a year, but it's actually been 1.5 years. And this 1.5 years is going to include the extraordinary COVID circumstances, which have presented some challenges for us in the crime and disorder area, but also provided some opportunities. Superintendent Parker and I are going to be co-delivering this update tonight. And we're not going to talk to each slide in the pack, you'll be pleased to know, but we're going to just draw out some of the key slides and talk to those. If we can ask for all questions to be saved until the very end of the presentation, that would be really helpful. And you may find that some of the questions that you have are actually answered further along in the presentation as well. So the slides that have been circulated contain all these sections. Section 1 is really helpful in terms of providing some background to the CSP, its context, and also what priorities it's working to for the next 3 years. So you're probably all quite familiar with all of that because that's included in the presentation every year. So we're going to start this evening at section 2. And that's the crime overview, which is from the 1st of April 2019 to the 31st of August 2020. And for this bit, I'm going to hand over to Superintendent Parker, and then I'll return and take you through section 3 and 4. Over to you, Superintendent Parker.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. Can I just check that you can see me and hear me before I keep going?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. So Alison and I and Tim have worked to make sure that we're giving you a really good overview of where we are around the crime and then what the Community Safety Partnership have been doing and focusing on. The slides are reflecting the period between April and August, and of course we're highlighting what's happened this year, and Alison has helpfully labelled it, all the slides, with COVID area. I can't deny that the exceptional circumstances we are in has had a dramatic effect on the crime, and we have seen a reduction, but it's not across the board, and so we want to just highlight some of the areas which are still a concern for us and that we're going to be working hard upon, but also highlight some of the good work that we've been doing and also some of the successes as well. So first of all, we're going to just look at where we stand in Bracknell Forest around all the crime that's being recorded. You can see here that Bracknell Forest is, in comparison to the most similar groups, far down on the left-hand side, which indicates that we do have a lower level of recorded crime per 1,000 population. This is a good news story, and I believe the next slide is also just gives it in figures as well, to say if we just focus on residential burglary here. Residential burglary is a real area personally that we focus on in policing, because we know what a detrimental effect it does have on our community members, not from losing personal possessions, but then that continual issue of feeling unsafe in their home. So it's a real priority for us. We can see that there was an increase last year, but now we're seeing a reduction of 16% this year. In fact, from April until now, we can see that there's only been 48 burglaries, and actually there have been very few over the last couple of months as well. So we're still just around the 50 mark of burglaries in Bracknell Forest. That's a continuing trend. We've shown that the figures with Berkshire and Thames Valley as well. So it's a really good picture around residential burglary for the residents here. Next, we're going to talk about theft from motor vehicle. Oh, sorry, just thank you, Alison. This just shows us again, it's similar for where we are against our most similar groups, but we are in the lower band around that. We're going to look at theft from motor vehicle. This has been a priority for the Crime and Safety Partnership, Community Safety Partnership. That's because of the significant amount of building work that's been going on in the area. Many of the people who've been coming and working in the area, the builders and the trades, have been targeted, and that has been by groups of people who are specifically using it as their business model to steal from these vans and trade people. So we did a lot of work with the CSP, which I'll talk about in a second, but you can see that the headline figure is last year there was a slight increase, but then this year a significant decrease by pretty much 50%. That is mirrored across Berkshire and Thames Valley. Next slide, please.
Sorry, trouble moving it on.
Okay.
Seems to have frozen on me.
I'll
Oh,
just,
there you go. There you go. It's working. It's working.
Yeah, well done, Alison. Thank you. So we're just trying to give you the context of what's happening in Bracknell Forest, but then also with our most similar groups with the other local authorities across the region. And you can see that actually this is a slightly different trend, that Bracknell Forest isn't towards the lower quartile, we're in the middle. This shows that there is a slight problem that we are trying to address, and we've done well, but there's still probably some more work to be done. And it's something that the CSP is working at to see what is happening with those local authorities where they have such a lower level, and see if there's anything we can learn from that. Next slide. And the next slide, please. So just to say that, to summarise, that most incidents are those theft of tools from the vans, but we have done a significant amount of work with the police and the local authority and the hotels and the tradesmen as well, site managers of those building sites with those housing developments, to make sure we're trying to do every single opportunity to stop those theft from motor vehicles being happening. It might sound a slightly more trivial crime compared to burglary, but actually these people it's their livelihood in the back of their vans. When things are being stolen, it then costs them a significant amount either on their insurance, and they can't go to work as well. So we really are trying to focus on that. Next slide, thank you. So the next area we're going to talk about is violence against the person. So this is the crimes of assaults against people either in a domestic abuse situation or out in the public. So it's a known offender or an unknown offender. Now, this is an area which we were talking about earlier in the CSP meeting, and certainly from the policing point of view, we're a bit concerned about, because we are seeing an increase year on year. You can see that year to date, we've had a 17% increase, and last year actually a 12% increase. It's no real comfort, but that is the same trend for Berkshire and for Thames Valley as well. So we're having to do some more work around that. We want to understand a little bit more about how we can get some preventions around those. I think one thing that I can reassure you about, it is something that my officers are spending more time focusing on with their investigations. We do need to do more preventative work, and that's going to be slightly difficult to tackle. However, when we do find out that these crimes have taken place and they're reported, we're being much more positive in getting the arrests in, getting people into custody, and then gathering the evidence at the earliest opportunity. So therefore we can then get the right outcomes for those victims, whether that is giving a community order or actually going through to court and getting them prosecuted at court. Next slide, please, Alison. So again, this does show that the violence against person, it's not a particularly different with most similar groups, but we can see that we are in the lower quartile for that. And the next slide. Another area that the CSP have been working on is around knife crime. Now, so the percentages are a little alarming, because there's such an increase of 22% last year, and it looks like 24% this year. It's varying a little bit. The numbers show that it's not that many. Only 26 incidents so far this year, but we've all seen what's happening locally in the news, and we're with some of our neighbouring authorities, and then also nationally, about the absolute criticality around what happens if someone is carrying a knife and they take that out and stab it. The consequences can be catastrophic, so we really have to focus on this. I have a zero tolerance attitude around this. We need to make sure that when we are having that report that someone is carrying a knife, we are being proactive to try and locate them. When we have had stabbings, which sadly we did have over the last couple of months in Bracknell, we are holding those offenders to court, and actually the people who committed that offence have already been remanded to prison. We're also upping our stop searches that we're doing to make sure that we're trying to seek out those who are carrying knives as well. So it is an area I think we do need to scrutinise further, and to make sure that we are up on that. We really want to keep this as low as possible and make sure we have significant messages around that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about most serious violence. So these will be the grievous bodily harm incidents, the stabbings. And you can see that actually we have a really low level of that in Bracknell, and it's something that I hope that we can be proud of. I'm aware that fear of crime is something which is always significant in our area, and I want to make sure that people are aware that we are a safe area. We are on top of these matters, and this graph does demonstrate that. And the next slide. And then the next slide as well, if I talk through that one, please.
Sorry, this one was just to show the COVID period.
Apologies. Yeah.
So the previous one was 2019-20, and this is the 6 months after.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Okay.
So when we're just talking about serious violence, this is something that we are doing more work with from the police's point of view. The Home Office have given us some funding to make sure that we are tackling serious violence, and we're working in partnership around that. And that does link into the CSP work. So we can see that we are one of the lowest levels in our most similar groups, which is positive. But we do need to work out how we can influence people to make sure that in a domestic incident that they aren't going to the kitchen and grabbing a knife, and that again, having serious consequences around that they aren't taking them out into the streets. That if a child is found with a knife in the school, then we are looking at how we can deal with that and try and resolve that problem for the long term for that young person. You should have hopefully seen in the news the weekend before last that we have done a significant work around Sandhurst and Crowthorne. I thought I'd just spend a little bit of time explaining what happened around that incident. Intelligence had been gathering for about 2 weekends that young people were gathering in the Sandhurst area and were fighting. And we had been going in there using our antisocial behavior powers, and we had located people with knives. So a real serious concern from us. And we worked with the schools, the youth workers, the police, and other members of the local authority and the CSP to find out what the intelligence picture is around there. We were worried that this was going to happen again for another weekend, so we used our Section 60 powers. And what that is we can go into an area, and with the intelligence picture we had around potentially people carrying knives, it means we could stop and search them without any further grounds. So we went there weekend before last, and we stop searched over the 3 nights 96 young people who fit that criteria. I'm really pleased that since we've done that, we have seen a massive downturn in any of those concerns in the intelligence picture. And beyond the police presence there, we were also working with the schools. We were making sure that they were giving out the messages about how dangerous it is to carry knives and the consequences around that. We worked with parents as well for any children we did stop search, that we went back to those parents to make sure we had a message around that. I just can't reiterate enough that with you in your communities, that we must make sure that we are doing our utmost to make sure that we don't have people carrying knives in the Bracknell Forest area. Next slide, please, Alison. This is just something which I know is something of a concern to everyone who's representing their communities, and that's drug-related incidents. So the CSP and the police have a zero tolerance around drug dealing, and we work very hard. I've got my tasking team who are out trying to locate who is dealing drugs in the area, and we take a kind of a no-nonsense attitude around that. We will be arresting people, we will be prosecuting people. We also work to make sure we understand who is at highest at risk to these drug dealing and who might potentially be exploited. So we identify those flats, those vulnerable people, we work with them to keep them safe across the partnership, and then from a police's point of view, we try to understand who is the organised crime behind that, who is running those drugs, and see what we can do to disrupt that as much as possible. We had a really successful county drugs lines week of action a couple of weeks ago, where we were carrying out warrants in the area, and had a lot more police officers in the area, sort of boots on the ground, to make sure we were trying to get that message across that it's not tolerated in this area. And next slide, please. This is another area which is a focus for the Community Safety Partnership, and it's around sexual offences. Again, you can see last year there was an increase in Bracknell and across the Thames Valley, and this year so far it's a decrease. It's a mixed picture around this. So if you just go on to the next slide, the points are that we have seen the more contact sexual offences are less, but actually more people are being abused online, whether that's sextortion, those kind of images, so where someone is asked to share an image and then they're blackmailed around those things. That can be a variety of people, whether a vulnerable adult, or it's more likely around young people. So the CSP has been doing some work with trying to educate those people and putting positive messages out and informative messages, particularly over the lockdown, to try and reduce that. Two more areas I just want to talk about. The next one is around domestic abuse. Now, this is by far our kind of biggest area of work from a policing point of view, and a significant area for the CSP as well. You can see that we've tried to show the difference between the crimes and non-crimes. So people regularly call 101 and 999 for police assistance. It doesn't necessarily meet the crime threshold, but it is important for the police to respond, to try and de-escalate what's happened and understand the risk of what's happening in that household. Once we go to an incident, we risk assess things from standard to medium to high, and then also we're able to signpost to the relevant authorities and also paint a picture as to what has been happening with those individuals. So someone might be calling the police and being a victim of an incident 4 or 5 times, so we might want to do some additional work with them. But you can see here that the crimes have been increasing from 2017 to 2018, 19, and then this year as well. Now, that is a concern. However, domestic abuse is something which is very difficult to control and have a short, sharp response around. So yes, there is that continual thing that it's good that people are reporting domestic crimes and that they have confidence in coming forward around these things. There's still that element that the police are catching up on our crime recording elements, and so there will be a little bit of reflection on that. But overall, I'm also seeing that there has been an increase in domestic abuse. What I can say again is that we have taken this as one of our priorities, along with the residential burglaries locally within the police LPA, and we've made sure that we are arresting those people, we are holding them to account, and we're supporting victims as much as possible as well. The right outcome for domestic abuse doesn't necessarily mean there's a charge. We can also use different things such as domestic violence protection orders, which have been a really useful tool, which bans the perpetrator from going back to that address and contacting the victim for up to 28 days. So we have a myriad of things which we are using, as well as using the support services available for that longer term recovery. And next slide, please. Again, so it just reiterates again that we talked earlier that there was an increase in violence against a person. When we're looking specifically at domestic abuse, we can see that there has been a significant increase year on year. Take with a little pinch of salt about the crime recording, but from my point of view, my message to you is domestic abuse crime is on the way up, and it is something that we are going to continue focus to make sure we get those messages across for people to have confidence to call the police and get that help. But what we really want to do is, when they spot the signs at the earliest opportunity that relationship is going wrong and is starting to become violent, that they call it the first instant rather than further down the line. And next slide, please. I think I've covered those elements there, and then the final element I'm just going to talk about, thank you, is antisocial behavior. So we can see last year we had a 5% reduction, so it's still over 1,000 ASB incidents and crimes in the Bracknell Forest area. And then this year so far there's been 655. So there has been an increase around that, which is a slight buck in the trend of Berkshire and in Thames Valley. But if we go on to the next slide, it explains that many of the ASB recorded incidents did include some of the COVID breaches, and there has been an escalation in some of that neighbourhood disputes and issues that are going on in parks. My only comment would be that they are relatively low level. Maybe people's tolerance has reduced. I think people's anxiety around the COVID period has heightened as well, and they wanted to come forward and tell the police, and rightly so, about that. But I don't want that message to come across that antisocial behaviour is getting out of control in Bracknell Forest. I believe that's not the case. And I hope you'll get some comfort that the fact that when we did have a significant concern and a risky intelligence picture, we took action and we got the Section 60 in place, and we worked in partnership to try and understand what the problem was and reduce that risk, which is what we successfully did in Sandhurst and Crowthorne area. So it's something which I know is a concern for people, but we are not seeing a great significant issue around ASB, but it's something that we are working on, and Alison and her team are making sure that there's the right information on the web pages to make sure that people have the right tools to make their complaint and resolve some of the issues as best as possible. And that's my whistle stop tour. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, that's great. Okay, so I'm just going to share some of the partnership working that's taken place during COVID, because it's really been quite remarkable. So you've been hearing that, the last 6 to 7 months have flagged up a change in our local crime and disorder profile in Bracknell Forest. And it's meant that we've had to really look with a fresh pair of eyes at the highest risks in our community in terms of crime and disorder. So where it was possible and where it was appropriate, we adopted a preventative approach. But where issues emerged without much notice, we raised them and we responded to them as a partnership as quickly as possible. And that's something that we'll continue to do going forward. So just wanted to highlight about domestic abuse. So I think, very early on in lockdown, we realized that we needed to work out how to keep victims of domestic abuse and their children safe if they were in the same space as the perpetrator for a prolonged period of time. We also had to think very carefully about how victims could access support confidentially if the only time that they had to speak to someone was possibly when they went out to visit the supermarket. So accessibility to information and support was absolutely key. This slide summarizes a few of the ways that we responded in what was definitely the most comprehensive DA response that our CSP has seen. One of the ways that we tried to ensure that victims had access to support information if they couldn't leave the house was, for example, with the use of bin hangers. So those little plastic tags that the refuse collectors could hang over the handle of the wheelie bin when they empty the refuse. And we had a discreet domestic abuse message on those bin tags alongside the collection calendar. So from the start of lockdown and going forward, we're going to continue to monitor levels of domestic abuse that's reported to police and also referred to support services on a weekly basis, so that we can make sure that we are prepared and equipped to support and safeguard. You've heard about the antisocial behaviour that we experienced over the summer in parks and open spaces. And this started off in May when we started seeing an increase in reports of COVID breaches and also some ASB reports in our parks and open spaces. And this came about due to a perfect mix, really, of an increase in home working, and that included in properties which were located on the periphery of those open spaces and parks. We also had schools and entertainment and leisure activities still all shut. And then we were told by Boris Johnson that we could leave the house and spend a few hours outside with a few of our friends, few people. So while the ASB was low level in nature, it did start to increase and was really impacting on those that were living and working close by. It also affected those that were visiting those areas and obviously placed a demand on our public services. A partnership task force was set up and a collaboration, not just of council services, but across organisations sprang into action And this included the youth service, parks and countryside, the fire service, police, and also our council comms team. And together they put together a program of youth outreach, police patrols, and also a high-profile anti-litter campaign, which did see antisocial behavior levels decrease significantly in August and September. That multi-partner response that Bracknell is renowned for was focused and effective, and that task force, that relationship has been established now. It's on standby, but it can reconvene if we have a recurrence of the issue. I'm sure you've all seen new information in the news about scams, and we started seeing very early on scams that were coming to our attention. And I think it's important to say that in times when there are high levels of fear, anxiety and confusion, uncertainty, as there was with the arrival of COVID, there are always going to be criminals who take advantage of that to benefit financially. So we started seeing COVID-related scams, including virus testing kits, vaccines, promises of miracle cures, and even COVID home cleaning services. We needed to make sure that these were shared with the community as quickly as possible so that we had as few victims of those scams as possible. And we did this through all the communication routes that we have, including our COVID community response initiative, and also through hard copy and social media routes. In terms of online safety, we also wanted to remind parents and carers about the main risks associated with increased online presence by young people who were studying and socializing at much higher levels from home. So we included advice and signposted them to reporting mechanisms through police and also through Action Fraud. I'm not sure if everyone's heard of cuckooing, but it's a form of crime where drug dealers take over the homes of vulnerable people so that they have a base to deal drugs. We don't see a lot of cuckooing here in Bracknell, but we do get some cases. Obviously, with people being at home more during lockdown and criminals needing to change the way that they sold drugs, we did start receiving increased reports of suspicious activity at a few properties in the borough. Some reports were malicious by neighbours and some were unfounded, but there were a few cases where we needed to collectively respond. And it needed to be a combination of enforcement towards the criminals and also making sure that we safeguarded any vulnerable victims. What was also really important was that we needed to offer the neighbours a reprieve from the antisocial behaviour that they might have been experiencing. So we have our partnership problem-solving groups, which are in place for just such issues. In addition to those, though, we set up a weekly liaison between community safety and the police to flag up addresses that we were concerned about. Police also held weekly tasking meetings to plan an enforcement response if it was appropriate, and if it needed to get taken to the PPSG for a much wider partnership response, then we would do that too. From the period 1st of June to the 30th of September, 5 closure orders were put in place. We also made sure that we appealed to the community to help with spotting the signs of exploitation that they might notice with family, friends, neighbours, and also importantly, how to report those concerns appropriately. The next few slides, which I won't talk through, but are there for information, include some of the successes that our CSP subgroups have seen and which we wanted to share with you. We would encourage you to read them and to note those successes because we're really proud of the journey that those groups have taken. I'm going to now move on to the final slide before we open for questions. So just to finish off this evening, I wanted to highlight some of the achievements over the last 18 months. Top of the list has to be the specific work related to COVID crime and disorder. I have personally been staggered at the resilience of the CSP. It's been phenomenal. It's innovation, it's determination to respond collectively, not just to business as usual, but to really pressing issues that have come to light as a result of lockdown. The CSP has also been incredibly flexible to adapt to home working, brand new technology, just like Zoom, and also things like reduced staff levels due to self-isolation. All the time keeping a close eye on the most vulnerable people in our community. Some of the work has truly been inspirational, and I can say with confidence that when the going got tough, our CSP got going. We still have a COVID journey in front of us, as you know, but with your support, we'll rise to the challenge again and continue to deliver to keep Bracknell Forest safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Felicity. First of all, under the questions, you'll notice on the agenda papers that we had previous notification of questions. Have you seen those? Aware of those? There was questions on the paper. I have some more. I think the first two questions have been answered in the presentation. I'm not sure on the third question. Can we just visit that? It says recently there was several incidents of serious unsocial behaviour in Westmoreland Park concerning young people drinking, etc., and a similar situation in the town centre. When such incidents occur, what is the policy of the police taking action, and would you support a no alcohol notice at a cut-off time to be agreed? I'm not sure we covered that in the presentation. Perhaps you could do it now.
No, we didn't. It sounds like that's a question for you, Felicity. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we do have antisocial behaviour in parks, actually, Alison, would it be possible for you just to describe what we did around those hotspots of ASB? Because I think that gives a bit of context, because basically what we did there, that's what we replicate elsewhere. Would that be helpful to give a bit of context around?
Yes, so when we consulted with the public in the end of 2019 about the CSP priorities and to get their views on whether they thought we had it right with the priorities that we'd chosen, we also asked for them to indicate any hotspots or antisocial behaviour issues that they had in their area. And we did that because we wanted to be community-led with that and not just tell everyone or say this is our understanding of the hotspots. We wanted to hear from the community. And we had a really, really good response to that. We had nearly 500 responses to that consultation. And we then spent a few months mapping all that information and noting down all the hotspots that were flagged up. And with some of the hotspots, some of them were quite broad. For instance, they might have included a whole ward, which would have been difficult for us to tackle. And then some of them went down to a much more acute level and gave us an actual address of somewhere that they felt was an antisocial behaviour hotspot. So we went through all of those one by one and took them to our partnership problem solving groups to have a look at. And what the partnership problem solving groups did was go through them and see whether there was anything that we weren't aware of. And if there wasn't, we responded to that. And we also made sure that those hotspots were on police patrol plans and that we raised their profile to make sure that we were taking into account that information. If there are persistent locations with hotspots or persistent individuals with antisocial behaviour that is being demonstrated, then our PPSG groups are the place for those cases. And as I've mentioned, it's a multi-agency group, and we make use of all sorts of powers, from a warning letter to a criminal behaviour order, right through to a closure order. So the group is really effective at resolving those issues. Just in terms of the question about an alcohol ban, I think what we would need to consider there is whether an actual ban after a certain time of night would be a proportionate response to two areas or two incidents of antisocial behaviour, one at Westmoreland and one at, in the town centre. I think that's the first thing we would need to think about. We would also need to consider how that ban would be enforced, because if that's in place, we would need to respond to that. Would we be able to? Or do we have sufficient resources to do that? So I think those are just a few of the considerations that we would need to take into account there.
Thank you, Alison. So sorry for not answering the question directly, but I think it's just really useful for you to know the context of how we layer up what our response is around antisocial behaviour, because we need to deal with things at the lowest possible level and at the earliest possible level. So in relation to Westmoreland Park, I believe we have been out into the area, and I will make sure that we increase the patrols to understand what the problems are there. But we have that regular review at that subgroup, so we could consider putting Westmoreland Park on one of those views to see what we can do longer term to resolve those issues. I am again with misuse of alcohol in public areas, again a step up areas, so the having a particular banning order is quite difficult for us to get in around the legislation, but my PCSOs and of course my officers do have that power to seize alcohol from underage drinkers and to take action around that, so they will be doing that. So thank you for the information around that. We will have a look at it, but I have already looked at asked my neighbourhood team to understand more about what that issue is, and we'll go to that problem solving subgroup to see what we can do longer term around it.
Mr. Chairman, could I just leave, Mr. Chairman, just as it was the question, but just leave in on a supplementary on that, Felicity. One of the problems is this seems to take quite a long time. At Westmoreland Park, there were several days of it, and there were several people making unsocial behaviour. There were kids drinking too late, etc., etc. I think what councillors want to know really is how quickly we can act in order to stop that, to protect the residents. And the idea of an alcohol ban quickly, which I know some cities do, they just do it for a period of time. Clearly, there's no point in doing it now because it's the middle of the winter. But during the hot spell, it was kind of important. So I think that's really what we're after. Okay.
Legislation does take some time to get through, and I think we need to take a proportionate response to that. We can do. It depends what the risk is. If it's just underage drinking, which then that is not we can't take a sledgehammer and to crack a walnut. We have to be careful, make sure that we are doing the right thing. But having the PCSOs engaging with the young people, finding out who they are, going to speak to the parents, seeing what the schools are doing, and having that kind of longer look, see if we can get some youth workers to come around and try and resolve that. But if it's a more serious issue, then yes, we can take into account the measures that we did in Sandhurst.
Okay, Felicity, thank you. We're going to move on because there's a number of people who have got questions. First of all, I've got a number of people on the chat have indicated, but I've also, previous to that, has requested, and some members have sent me indications of their questions, so I'll call them as we go through. If I could start with Councillor Mossam, you had a question? Hello? Councillor Mossam, are you there? No? Then we'll move on to Councillor Temperton. Mary, you had some questions?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. After your data inspection of 2017-19, we had a presentation at the overview and scrutiny from the Thames Valley Police, and it definitely said that one of your aims was that more of the reported crimes will be recorded. So you would expect all those figures you gave us tonight to be higher, really, or you'd expect some of the numbers in the increase to be due to the fact that more of the reported crimes are actually being recorded. You mentioned this when it came to domestic violence, but I wondered what the influence has been and the effect of this has been on the other numbers there. And I would also particularly like to ask, because one of the things that frightened me very much in the report and the inspection was that rape, it said that more reported rape will be correctly identified and recorded as such. Now, you haven't mentioned rape cases at all, but if you could say where they're included in all those figures and whether they are now being identified and recorded. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So, yes, our crime recording was highlighted by the Her Majesty's Inspector Constabulary for the police, and said that we weren't recording crime correctly. It wasn't that we weren't responding and dealing with it, it's just that the way we recorded it wasn't correct. So maybe we would have said that there's been an assault here, but then there was a criminal damage as well, or which happened in a domestic incident. We hadn't done both bits. So we've upped our game around that. And domestic abuse was the biggest significant area around this. Because it's such a big volume for us. And so the key areas which I pointed out today, which are the things which we focus on in the in this community safety partnership, around residential burglary or robbery or ASB, these numbers are much lower. So the crime recording problem we had wouldn't necessarily make such an impact on those crimes that we've also gone into detail with. The reason why it's so important with domestic abuse is that it's such a large volume. So we were seeing that we weren't really reflecting what was happening and what we were going to. There was no question that we weren't responding and dealing with the incident. It was just our housekeeping was needed to be improved. And I suppose that's reflected around rape and our most serious sexual offences as well. Again, I haven't been aware that we've had a particular issue around how we're recording rape investigations, and certainly on our local area, sadly rapes do take place, and one of the advantages of some of the changes we've been having, and if you dialed into the Chief's presentation last month, you'll hear that we have got a dedicated CID team, which is now working just for my local police area for Bracknell and Wokingham. So we have a much closer link with those who are carrying out the investigations of some of the most serious crimes. So again, to reassure you that rape is not a common crime, but we do have specialists who are dedicated to carrying out those investigations, and it's not a crime recording problem. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Mary?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Tullett.
Right, thank you, Chair. First of all, can I just say well done to the partnership and the police. It looks like you are really working very well together. And a very quick apology not to have flagged up my question beforehand, but I've actually had other things on my plate as well, as I'm sure everybody else has. I have, however, just given you a brief introduction as to what I'm going to ask, but it follows on, strangely enough, directly from Mary's question with regards to domestic abuse. But instead of numbers, which is interesting, it's sad to see that it's such a heavy workload, but I'd like to know what the outcomes are. And with regards to actually those that are being prosecuted, I am interested, but it's not for me as significant how many cases are reported. It's how many actually come to the court, get dealt with successfully, and within that, how many retraction statements are actually taken on face value and the case dropped. How many lead to hostile witness applications, and do you actually force it through regardless? Now, I don't know whether it's Alison or Felicity that answers that question, but probably a bit of both.
That's me.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm.
Agree.
Thank you. So outcomes, you're right, it is really important. I would highlight, though, that for domestic abuse, police turning up, making decisions, getting arrests done is really important, because we get that separated area where the victim can start to kind of rebuild and think about some plans about what happens next. Obviously, I really want to make sure we are holding people to account and that they are able to get to court. I suppose you should be made aware, and maybe you are, but the court system is in a really difficult position at the moment because of the backlog, because they haven't been open and they have the reduced service because of COVID restrictions. So it is more difficult to get cases to court because it's taking a lot longer. I can tell you that I know that for my area, when there's violence against the person and there's someone is injured in a domestic abuse situation, I know that 20% of those cases we are getting an outcome which could be a charge, which is most likely a charge. That means that they're going to court. I can't give you the outcome rate at court because I don't know it on the top of my head. But with my experience of working with domestic abuse for many years, is that if we get a charge, it's more likely that the offender will go guilty because that threshold to get a charge from the Crown Prosecution Service is quite high, because they don't want to waste court space. So they want to make sure that we have that level of evidence there. And an important thing for me to come across with is yes, the police listen to the victim and find out what has taken place. Sometimes they are unable to tell us exactly what's happened. They may have told us on the 999 call, and then they don't feel safe enough to actually provide a statement. They worry about the consequences significantly. But we will use a lot more of our tools to try and gather evidence. We have body-worn cameras. We can gather evidence from the scene. We can obviously gather evidence from the offender, witnesses, etc. And then we carry out what we call a evidence-based prosecution. So that means we use the evidence which we've gathered, despite the victim not providing us with a statement, because we take domestic abuse so seriously that we must hold those offenders to account and put them to court, and hopefully get that separation needed, whether it's because of a prison sentence or restraining orders or non-mols, etc. So yes, it is a barrier we are aware of, but we have ways of getting around that, and we are working extremely hard to try and get more and more offenders charged with offences around domestic abuse.
Can I have a quick follow on, please, Chair?
Thank you. Yeah, can we be brief, Malcolm, please? There's people queuing up, so I want to get...
It is extremely brief. The question is, with regards to the court cases being delayed and everything else, the chances of influence by the perpetrator are even greater. And that's why I was keen to know what the level of retraction statements are in the system, if you know it. Thank you.
I'm really sorry, the comms went down. Sorry, you have to repeat it.
Sorry, because of the delays in the court system, the implication to that is that the influence that's brought to bear by the perpetrator can be that much greater, and therefore retraction statements will increase. So what are you actually doing when you get a retraction statement?
Well, we manage that throughout anyway, but when someone has been charged, they'll have bail conditions, most likely not to contact or see or visit the home address of the victim. So there's that safeguarding element there. But we work to keep the victim engaged throughout the whole process, and we will overcome that matter if need be, but have a conversation with the CPS. But it depends what the other evidence is there.
Could we have some figures later on as to that?
If you ask the question, please, if you get that sent through to me, I will try and find the information out for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, can I very quickly add something?
Yes.
Thank you. I agree with everything that Felicity's saying in terms of that work with the perpetrator. But I think what's also really important here is that we need to instill that confidence in the victim. The victim needs to feel that they are supported and that they are going to be walked through the process as much as possible. And in Bracknell, we commission Berkshire Women's Aid, and we also have our early help service and a number of victim programs. And we wrap that service around the victim and their children to make sure that to maximise the chances of them continuing that journey through the court. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Moving on then to Councillor Badibo. Michael?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, we can hear you. Can you keep the questions brief, please?
I will try. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Alison and Felicity, for coming tonight. Thank you for the presentation, and more importantly, thank you for looking after us in Bracknell Forest. We feel really safe, and we're grateful for everything that you guys do. I go back to the slides, where you show us all the performance statistics. Some of them were going up in terms of numbers. I'm just trying to understand when we talk about measuring performance and success, when we display or trying to highlight successes, what were your original targets in terms of the numbers with most of the crime groups or types that you've shown us tonight? And also, what would be, I've been interested, I would have loved to see, for example, burglary, how many of the crimes were actually solved? Because that is what is important, I think, to our residents in terms of effective policing. Yes, we have prevention, but I think the public are also interested to know that something is being done when crimes are committed, because they are just, the outcome of that is the deterrent to reduce crime.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shall I go first, Felicity?
You go first, Alison.
Okay, if you do the burglary outcomes, I'll do the targets. So in terms of the CSP targets, Councillor Godibo, we don't have specific percentage reduction targets in our performance plan, and the reason why that is, we did originally have those, but it's very difficult to set a numeric target, and then, if something happens, like COVID, and then, the figure, we don't make those targets, then that's seen as a failure. What we are all about is reducing. So instead of having a numeric target, it's about reducing. So making people safer and reducing the crimes that people are experiencing, reducing the number of victims.
And to build on that, I think what the Community Safety Partnership is, it is about reduction, but it's about having that more holistic view of what we're trying to achieve in the community and building that resilience. So I think you can ask me about what kind of targets I have around those crime elements, but the partnership is a lot more in depth around that. So no particular targets for the CSP, but from my point of view around residential burglaries, the chief asked me to reduce residential burglary by 5% this year, and then over a 3-year period reduce it by 15%. But because of COVID and because everyone's been in their homes, burglars have not been very fruitful. So that target is kind of out the water. But we did manage, last year, we did manage a reduction of about 3%. So we didn't quite get there. And outcomes, you're right, is really important. So last year, our outcome rate was approximately 15%. And this year as well, we are just under that at 12%. So what that means is we are charging those offenders for 12% of those crimes and sending them to court. It would be great if it was much higher. And that we were holding, one in every 5 burglars to account, and that's what we're aspiring towards. Some burglaries are just really difficult to investigate because you do have professional burglars out there who don't leave a trace around what they're doing, and we have to be a lot more creative in how we're trying to capture them. But last year we did capture them, and there was a group that had committed 30 burglaries in the area, not just our area, but across different local authority boundaries as well. So it's not beyond us by any means. It just unfortunately takes a few more of those burglaries to happen for us to get that intelligence picture and build that evidence, because at some point they will slip up and we will get them on that, and that's what we do. So that's where we are with our outcome rate.
Thank you. Can I just have a quick follow-up? I'm trying to, when you engage the public or you consult the public, what do you think, or what are they saying is the effective, targets or rate they expect in terms of solving crime and things like that, and reduction?
I think that's one for me. We don't actually ask that question. We ask them whether the priorities that we're looking at are a reflection of what they feel is appropriate for Bracknell Forest. We don't ask the question about percentage rates, I'm afraid.
And I can imagine they would say that they would want no burglaries to happen because no one wants that to happen. So we will always strive to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Mattock.
Thank you. My question relates to antisocial behaviour. In this time when people are asking other people to cycle a lot more than they have done, they are a growing menace, particularly in the town centre, but elsewhere. And our notices up saying no traffic. Nobody seems to be doing anything. Cyclists are going from side to side, they're totally being on the wrong side of the street. They're doing wheelies, and now added to this, you're getting the e-scooters, which were even more dangerous. Can someone tell me, please, who is doing something about it to stop these mostly young people cycling in places they shouldn't be? Thank you.
I think I can answer that one, Felicity, if you'd like.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, that is something that is on our radar. Cycling in the town centre has been a bit of an issue ever since the town centre was regenerated for a number of reasons, really. There is some direct routes through it between one of the schools and the college. So there are, lots of young people riding around. The signage in the town centre that was installed when the town centre was built wasn't the same signage that we had previously. The previous signage was really clear with a picture of a bicycle with a line through it, whereas now the signage is far more confusing. And I think there's been a lack of understanding about that. So I think about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we did a comms campaign to make people aware that although the signage had changed, and that wasn't a Bracknell signage decision, it was a national signage decision, that cycles were forbidden to be ridden in the town centre and needed to get off and walk. We were actually about to do a spring campaign in the town centre when COVID struck, stopping people that were on their bikes and making them aware that they couldn't ride. And you're right about e-scooters, we have seen more of those. And I know that the town centre police team have been actively stopping e-scooter riders when they see them in the town centre. But I think the challenge with cycling and e-scooters in the town centre is that you really do need someone almost stationed at every entrance to the town centre all day and in the evenings as well to make sure that doesn't happen, because I'm not sure we're going to manage to stop every single one. I know the Lexicon have also been fantastic. They've put much clearer signage up as well, but we're still having some issues here and there with cyclists and e-scooters. Just to say about e-scooters, I know that police are actively also looking at issuing Section 59 notices to people on e-scooters, because you actually do need insurance and you do need a driver's license and you do need a helmet if you're going to be riding on public land. So they're taking action wherever they can, but unless you've got someone there permanently all the time, it's going to be difficult to tackle everyone.
Okay, thank you, Alison.
Can I just come back and say, it isn't only in the town centre, this problem, it's outside as well. It's in the estates. They have no respect for pedestrians whatsoever.
Yes, I have seen one or two e-scooters myself, and not always ridden by adults who would have a driver's license or, a 17-year-old. So I think there is more work to do there. I'm not sure if it has decreased and schools have gone back and the weather's changed a little bit. It's something that I think we need to do a bit more comms work on.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, we've got two more. Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Alison and Felicity for their presentations. At the risk of being parochial, can I just take us back to Westmoreland Park, not least because it's a lovely part of the borough, but also the issue of antisocial behaviour by younger people over the summer months, partially caused by lockdown and not having to attend school. Clearly now, at this time of year and into the spring, we anticipate it's likely to be less of a problem for the people who live around the park. But given the length of time it could take to put in place satisfactory measures to address this, and the fact it's happened this summer and may well reoccur, what steps should we be taking now so that we are adequately prepared and ready to respond promptly and proportionately if this reoccurs when the weather improves next year?
I think what we need to do is let's have a good kind of deep dive of what's happened in that area. Let's have a look at the reports that have come through to the police, and maybe do some consultation, and then we can have a review to see what would be the right course of action, and see if there's what would be useful. Alison, would you agree that would be maybe a project for the PPSG to have an overview of what's there?
Yes, earlier in the summer, when the problem started to emerge, we were looking at the nature of the incidents and times of day and so on. I think it's probably worth mentioning that, and you will know this, but there were extraordinary times, and I would hope that we wouldn't see a reoccurrence of that, because it was just a perfect mix of things that would no doubt lead to that sort of antisocial behaviour. I do understand that quick action is needed, and the task force that I mentioned earlier, that is cross-organisational and dealt with that issue very quickly and effectively once it became an issue that that was causing a bit of an issue. We've got that group, that task force on standby, so it's ready to go. We would encourage members of the public to ring through their concerns to the police, either on 101 or through the online reporting form, because when those reports are made, that then it creates a problem-solving record with police, and then that will get brought to the PPSG to problem solve. So we're all ready. We've got everything there. Early notification by the public would be great if things start to emerge.
It'd be useful to know, was this a problem just for this year, or was it last year as well? Because if it was just this year, then I think we can maybe give there a little bit of leeway and make sure that task force does just step up, and maybe a bit of feedback offline from the local councillors would be useful around that.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Barnard. Gareth, can you hear me? No, then we'll move on to the last question from Councillor Mrs. Burke.
Yeah, hang on. Sorry, I can. It's just a bit of a delay.
Catch up.
No, it was Chair, if it's helpful, just to very briefly comment on issues up at Westmoreland Park, and to say a huge amount did go on this summer with I think some very effective work between the police, youth workers, PCSOs and others, which actually led up to the fact that some really good communications were established. And following on from Councillor McLean's comments, I'm convinced that there's a workable plan in place for April, May of next year. But, as has been said this evening, I think it's constant vigilance, because when the weather gets warmer, I think we need to pull up on that. But just to say, towards the end of the summer, a lot kicked in place. But I will say, Chair, of course, we don't know whether it was the work we were doing or the fact it suddenly got a bit colder and wetter. I think the new year will show which is the more valid perspective on that.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. Jill?
Oh, thank you very much, Chairman. Felicity and Alison, thank you very much. Very informative as always, and very interesting. I was just going to actually ask, if you don't mind, about you said 2 weeks ago about county lines. It's one of the things as Alison knows, I'm very passionate about this. I knew that there was a changes and the modus operandi, or whatever what you call it, that I know they changed, but how Can you tell us a little bit about what you found? And I'm interested in sexual exploitation. Has that affected this area, and how are you dealing with that?
Do you want to go first for that one, Felicity?
Yeah, I'm just working out.
Yes, I am too.
So county drugs lines is a continual issue that we need to make sure we're keeping on top of. And in Bracknell, sometimes we do have county drugs lines, but sometimes we have local lines, so just local drug dealers. Either way, they have the same consequences, that there is an increase in risk to our communities, because you've got more activity around there. So, and the bit which we're most concerned on is that bit which Alison explained around the cuckooing. So what we had, there was a national operation which took place a couple of weeks ago, where we did our own local work, which meant we did some warrants on particular addresses, that they were actually on Woking side, not on Bracknell side. But what it was also was additional resources working with our neighbourhood teams to go onto those particular areas where we're concerned that drug dealing is happening, and also go and do those welfare checks where we feel that people have been targeted previously. Is there anything more specific you want to know around that before I move on to exploitation?
Well, obviously there are certain areas that I have heard that there's been more activity, particularly in my ward, and I just wondered, I'm not being too specific because obviously this is a meeting that's public domain, but it's just that I was very concerned about certain things, and I just wondered if you'd sort of really concentrated on, say, blocks of flats and...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Alison explained a little bit about our how we gather our intelligence and have those weekly and bi-weekly meetings around what the problems are. And I am so proud of our tasking team, which is a group of a few officers, but they are exceptional because they know who's being targeted, who's operating in the area, how they're working, and they go and, you know, time and time again, they are making arrests. We aren't really going to solve the problems around drug dealing, but we can make sure we try and make it as difficult as possible for those who are operating in our area and make them feel uncomfortable about coming to Bracknell and the Bracknell Forest area. And that's what their job is to do. So, so they are doing an exceptional work on that. So yes, they will be targeting particular flats, particular areas at hotspots that they know are frequented. The important thing is we keep on top of those things, because unfortunately you get one drug dealer out the way, another one comes in, but you get on top of them as much as possible. We need to have that community intelligence around who is doing what, and so I would really ask all of you, if you know of any concerns of that, speak to your local PCSO, share that intelligence, and encourage your residents to do the same. In relation to exploitation, we do look at this particularly around children, and we have a mechanism which one of the slides is around the multi-agency child exploitation subgroup that we have. And actually strategically we're putting another layer on across the Bracknell Forest, where myself and the DCS Sonia Johnson is going to chair a meeting to make sure we've got that really clear view of how exploitation is taking place, whether it's sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, etc. So we really do work very hard to try and get those things. There is not a particular worry area around this, but we can never take our eyes off this, because we have to make sure we are protecting our young people from that.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add one little thing, Chair? Sorry.
Yep.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on the MACE and the new strategic subgroup, Felicity, that's great. Just to also say that with exploitation, it's also about making the public aware and how to recognise all the signs. I think we sometimes assume that people will just know, but they don't necessarily know. And at the moment, this week, we've just started a brand new campaign called AWARE, which stands for Awareness with Action Reduces Exploitation. Let's think about that for a second. And it's starting off this week with some text social media quotes, and not quotes, but messages of, advice, links to support. And that's going to include county lines awareness and also modern day slavery, sexual exploitation, and so on. And then that's going to be followed up next week with actual videos of those key messages again. And then at the end of November, there's actually going to be a webinar, so a virtual webinar where people can sign on through Eventbrite, and then they'll be able to watch a series of presentations delivered by colleagues on those areas again, sexual exploitation, county lines, and it'll be free to attend, and anyone can come and learn a little bit more about it.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you very much, Alison. I just recently went on a webinar and it was really good. So thank you for that. I'll do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, members, I think we need to move on through the agenda. I think to Alison and Felicity, I think by the variety of questioning, you can see the concerns that people have and express to members. But most importantly, thank you for coming along and sharing with us the answers to some of the questions that we really want the answer to go back to residents. So both of you, once again, thank you very much. Very informative, and we all appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
Very welcome.
Thank you very much. Take care.
You. Moving on, just as tidying up, just to say that I have to say and mention to you that Councillor Brossard is present, because he wasn't when his name was called out at the beginning. That covers that, and I won't get into trouble from Louise and Kirsty. Right, we'll move on then to item 7, education and school-related mental health and other issues that are there. A little unusual from previous is in which we do things on the agenda. What we've done is to members have put questions up, and rather than go through long reports from officers at this current time, we've put the questions down and submitted them to our executive member, Councillor Barnard. So as he's got some forewarned intelligence, and really if we work through those, Gareth, I think that would help.
Yeah.
Again, it's concerns that I guess have been expressed to members from residents and people talking to, and of course education in schools has been way up there at the top with experience with COVID. So I think without further ado, if I can ask you to come in and talk to us about it, and particularly if we work through the questions, would be helpful. Thank you.
I mean, thank you very much, Chair. I mean, I thought there's some very good questions here that maybe with your indulgence, I could just sort of maybe give a more general update to where I think we are, and then we can work through the questions. So, I mean, I think the first thing is to say that we have an interesting relationship with our schools because we don't actually run them. It's the role of the governing bodies to run schools. This is the local management of schools. And of course, when we come to academy schools, they have complete autonomy. And our powers only really legally or in law go as far as intervening with schools that cause concern. Having said that, I think that all our schools, academy and local authority schools, have worked together absolutely superbly during the pandemic. And what's been really great is to see them sharing good practice, helping each other out, because remember, our schools were open to key worker and vulnerable children through the Easter holidays, bank holidays, half terms, right up to the end of the summer holiday. And just with very, very little notice, using the IT expertise they had, of course, they devised home learning strategies, tried wherever possible to push out the probability in how to work from home. That was in the days before the lockdown. And I think, did a really amazing job. And if we take some of our specialist provision, College Hall, for example, our pupil referral unit, put in place very early on day-to-day contact with the vulnerable children, of course, that they have provision for. And that went even as far as in the home setting, actually where necessary and where important, providing, you know, food parcels and things like that to ensure that the families were well placed. Incidentally, of course, that also led to some really good learning practices in the PRU, which I think will be taken forward from that. And actually, more generally, once the pandemic sort of really kicked off and we were in lockdown, we had lots of vulnerable children who were not in school for various reasons, who were being weekly contacted by the school, some doorstep visits from school staff, making sure that school meals vouchers and other things were handed out. So the whole school community came together. And I think it's fair to say, since the return from the summer holiday, governing bodies with their leadership teams have worked hard to risk analyse what needed to happen and got children back into school. And as you will know as members and others from what you've seen on social media and what's been reported, you know, we have had a number of incidents of COVID-19 in schools, and that has led to some pretty challenging times. But at all times, I think the schools are pulling together. And I'm really pleased to be able to just let colleagues know tonight that on the back of this and some superb support from the MP for Bracknell, James Sunderland, he's arranged for a group of our head teachers to participate in a virtual meeting with him next week to really sort of explore from both a primary and a secondary perspective the challenges that COVID-19 have brought into schools. And Robert Halfon, chair of the Education Select Committee, is someone whose views are respected and held in high regard in the Department for Education. So I hope, as well as future benefit to Bracknell Forest schools, we'll see that more widely, you know, in terms of the DfE's response to schools. So, Chair, I can take the first question as written and really sort of try and just pull those together. So, schools supported families where they could with laptops and 4G devices if they didn't have access to broadband at home. And there are a number of our families that are in that situation. They didn't always have the ability to do that early on because resources were quite hard to come by initially, but there were some laptops that came from the government. They came a little bit later than we would have wanted, but also then the sort of the 4G network dongles came up. So the 4G network was for those households that didn't have broadband. It wasn't always possible to make sure that every child at home had an individual device. And so what you also found in this, that where team Zoom type meetings weren't available either to set work or actually to have whole class teaching or assemblies and things, that schools where possible copied paper, you know, workbooks, or actually allowed through email access workbooks to be printed at home and things like that. So as that and the provision of broadband and the provision of IT strategies is very much an individual school function, schools developed strategies that fitted with the resources they had and could develop, and also that wherever possible met the needs of children. And indeed, that worked on through towards the end of the summer term, and contingency plans have been put in place because, of course, since the summer, particularly at secondary, we've seen a number of youngsters self-isolating due to close contact, and also we've had in recent weeks a few year group closures at a number of schools, and work has been put in place. A lot of work was done through websites, and schools generally were quite good because they do often have people on their payroll who actually are IT experts. I mean, you know, it's a function of the area we live in. So, I mean, we did see, I mean, particularly in the case of my own daughter's school, you know, teams being rolled out in a test basis 2 or 3 days before lockdown as a consequence of, you know, year group lockdowns at the moment, home learning being set again. It's been creative, it's been innovative, and particularly in the case of primary, where resources were a little bit more stretched during the lockdown, there was online access to a primary academy, a virtual academy called the Oakwood Academy, where schools could basically dial into a national virtual academy for primary teaching. Great resources, but just sometimes trying to get that provision to match into where particular schools were in teaching the curriculum was a bit of a challenge. But there were quite a few resources. I think if there was an issue that we'd want to flag, some of the provision came a little bit later than would have been helpful. But given, I guess, that as a country, we reinvented the education system in the space of 2 weeks in March, I think a lot was achieved. And that's a huge credit to the governors and to leadership teams of our schools. And even today, Chair, you know, day to day things are moving on, and provision is developing, emerging. So, I mean, I think hopefully, I think just to finish on that, IT integration, again, school to school function, we're getting better, and a real push at the moment on making sure that there's digital access for all children. And if I can just add to that, a really interesting appeal from one of our primary schools, which I think will be taken further through the media and has featured in the Bracknell News, which is because of lockdown and home working, the cost of laptops has gone up. And we'll come on to talk about budgeting later, but the squeeze on resources means that a number of schools, I think, particularly led by one primary school, are really asking and hoping that local business might be able to help them in the further provision of laptops and things, so they can further extend, you know, their virtual reach into the home. But overall, I think a solid response to a really challenging situation. And I think trying to get more and more youngsters digitally enabled and able to access and work with these platforms has been, you know, pretty successful. And we hope, you know, capacity will boost, and who knows what the next few weeks will bring. But I think overall, you know, there's been a good approach to home learning from that. I know that answers the first question. Chair, if others have additional questions on that topic.
Members, are there any questions on that particular question?
Could I ask a question, Chairman?
Yes, Councillor Virgo.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, I was trying to find my video. Apologies. Councillor Virgo. Gareth, can I just ask you, one of the problems I've got that's been given to me from someone is the internet connection. And I suppose we all have this problem actually all the time. But some of the schools don't have a sort of procurement system whereby, you know, they very much do their own internet. Is there any way we can help them do this? Can we help in some way?
20 or so years ago, we did, because of course, when we first became a unitary, there was the National Grid for Learning, and we worked closely with Cisco Systems that had a big school push on the National Grid for Learning to provide in those days, you know, internet access into schools. One of the direct consequences, Councillor Virgo, of the local schools management situation is that schools have a responsibility for procuring their own, you know, IT and broadband resources. And what has happened in practice is across our schools that a number of schools decided that they could do on their own than to form part of, you know, a standardized central procurement. So it's not feasible or practical. Having said that, I think what we do have is quite a high level of IT expertise in our schools, and certainly having spoken to a number of schools, that they felt well placed to access this. The real issue that we had was that there are not a insignificant number of households in the borough, and generally speaking, and I don't wish to, you know, sort of stigmatise or up, but generally speaking, there are families and households with challenges where there wasn't access to broadband for whatever reason, and so more concerned about focusing on getting resources into those households so that they can access the curriculum. But sad to say, Tony, that this is very much a delegated function down to individual schools, and it's not possible for us to do that. And one of the other challenges, Tony, as well as even across Bracknell Forest, which you would have hoped would have been one of the most IT digitally enabled boroughs, talk to any residents and they will tell you that there are highs and lows, far lows of internet access across the borough, and schools are not immune. But no, it's an important issue, but you know, sadly, it's not one that we can directly control.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. Are there any other questions on that?
I think Councillor Sandringham had a question.
Yes, Sandra?
Yes, thank you. Okay, my question is, do we have any information on how the lockdown and the stringency of new COVID secure school regulations are affecting the mental health of our children?
Sandra, the answer to that question is there's a lot about that, but if I look at my agenda, we are actually going to come on to talk about the mental health issues in a little while. So if you're okay, I'm quite happy to fold that question up at that point, Chair.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
Okay, so we go on to the next point. Are the teachers adequately protected during lessons?
Yes. So, I mean, there are several levels of protection that we have here. So the first is, if we think about COVID risk facing schools, every week, and you know, we a group of us meet to sort of consider the latest positions. So that is the head of service, Rachel Morgan, the chief executive, the leader, and myself. We receive a report on the incidence of COVID within Bracknell Forest, and we put that up against the criteria to ensure safe school opening in general, and we make recommendations accordingly. So there's a constant process of updating the general COVID risk as it relates to schools. Then if we move into schools, schools have come up with their own risk analysis, which is based on their premises, how people can safely social distance, how bubbles can be created in those schools, and then how teachers can interact. Teachers can or cannot wear face coverings. We've been supportive of those that wish to, but I think it's fair to say if you talk to a number of teachers, they believe that that teaching is an immersive situation. So actually the ability, particularly when doing small group tuition with more vulnerable youngsters, those with additional needs, that actually the ability to see the face is really important in terms of communication. So looking at social distancing, more generally to help reduce the transmission risk of COVID in schools, you've got the bubble system, which means that groups are taught in a tight group and move around together. And indeed, many schools have reduced the number of classes, but extended the time of the lessons, so to reduce moving around. And at secondary, further enhance the safety of all members of the school community. It's now generally accepted that outside the classroom, so that's in communal areas, break time, play times, that face coverings will be worn on school premises from when they enter and leave. So are teachers adequately protected during lessons? I think we're doing all we can on that. The LA supported schools with risk assessments, so we gave them templates to work on to ensure that these processes are properly followed through. And we've certainly helped and assisted with the provision of PPE. And again, that was particularly important in the case of Kennel Lane, our special school, where the requirements are quite high. So we have done all we can. And although the question says, are teachers adequately protected? I think more widely, we have worked to protect all members of the school community. And what you're seeing now in terms of the year group closures that you're seeing across a number of schools is because there's also a very rigorous track and trace and, you know, follow up on close contacts, so as to make sure that risks are minimised and the actual number of members of the school community affected are reduced as far as possible. And if I can just say that this is a day-to-day thing, and one of the big things at the moment is schools are existing day-to-day because this entire agenda occupies a huge amount of leadership time, you know, to make sure that on a day-by-day basis, members of the school community is kept as safe as possible. Additional questions on that one?
Thank you, Gareth. Are there any questions from members on that specific item? Councillor Brown, you've got a question up on the chat. Is it about the teachers' protection?
It wasn't. It was about the previous one, about how pupils are engaging with the online lessons, if I may ask that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, that actually I can probably tie up, Chair, with the next question, which is motivation.
Motivation, yeah.
I mean, the answer to that is, well, generally across the borough, and also from very much personal experience, having had a secondary school youngster at home, it really varied day to day, lesson to lesson, subject to subject. But I think it's fair to say that given that the lockdown meant that a lot of virtual teaching in various forms started in March, I think it was generally noticeable that there was, you know, a huge amount of engagement, and teachers were reporting a large amount of engagement, but there were a significant minority, as there were across the country, who just didn't engage at all. So the situation that you actually had was teachers would follow up, as I said before, tailor work as far as possible, you know, engage on the doorstep with families. You actually had virtual assemblies. You had some whole class teaching, some half class teaching, online, introduced a sense of fun, made sure that lessons were differentiated, that there were activities taken outside. I mean, for example, fajita cooking online was great. I mean, there were some virtual cookery classes. Some schools had cookery competitions. Some had other quizzes and things like that. So, I mean, just really creative and innovative in how to engage. But I think, you know, a lot of youngsters generally started to hit the wall by the time they got to the summer half term, because, you know, I don't know about you, but, you know, if I'd had to spend my entire life sitting in front of a computer screen from March to summer, I think we'd have all had a measure of demotivation. But to be fair, schools kept this going for a long time. And
in university, of course.
Sorry, Councillor, and I think.
Well, sorry, I said Open University, of course, was in my days.
well, yes. They were probably pound, shillings, and pence, Councillor Berger, but we'll move. I think the bottom line on this is that fundamentally the children missed the face-to-face contact with their teachers and face contact with their friends on a daily basis, because actually socialisation is as important a part of an education system as are lessons. And I think what was really interesting was when schools came back again in September, head teachers have reported some fantastic behaviour, but a desire from a huge number of students just to be back in school, to be with their friends. So laughter and enthusiasm going into schools, and schools have managed to maintain that momentum for many children. My concern is the demotivated group that didn't engage, because actually amongst that group are probably some of those children who most benefit from being in school. And that's not those officially classed as vulnerable, but that wider group that didn't. And that's where I think there's a lot of focus now children are back in school, actually trying to work with them and support them. And actually today I was out and about in Moorfield, and I met with one of our education welfare officers who was actually charged with getting some of the slightly harder to reach children back into school. And she was saying that without exception, the children that she's working with are actually all back in school and are engaging to a reasonable extent, and certainly communicating with the support by text message. And linked into that, I think for a number of youngsters, and it sounds really strange, but actually they really value being back in school. They've actually missed it. And you know what? When we come on to talk about the next subject, that could prove to be a real benefit when we think about emotional well-being and mental health. But, you know, I think they did amazingly. I mean, this class of COVID, call it what you want, you know, we could look at these children and say, do you know what? You went through something that none of us went through when we went through our formal education. And look at you, you've gone back into school, jumping up and down in September, well-behaved, ready to learn, respectful of your teachers. Maybe we could work a little bit harder on some of the social distancing and things like that. But you know what? I think we've got through it, but we've got to look at that group that haven't engaged. And I'm rather hoping that the head teachers, when they talk to Robert Halfon, will raise the need to make sure that there's appropriate resources in place for that catch-up, for that group that's identified. They don't feature on child protection plans or other degrees of vulnerability, SEN, things like that. They are those that didn't engage, who would benefit from that sort of small group, just catch up and tuition. And schools are doing that. But, you know, I think that's where the focus is.
Okay, before we just move on, Gareth, can I just come back to Councillor Brown to see if she's satisfied with the
answer? Are you
answer?
happy with that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good. Okay, Gareth. Do you want to move on to the next one?
Yeah. So
I ought to mention that we also have in attendance is our other executive member, Councillor Dow. Yeah. So, well, whether you're doing it together or taking each.
Well, if I start off on the school-related one, then sort of not wishing to throw Councillor Birch under the metaphorical bus, then I'll let him come in on the health and well-being response to this. So if I take the school one first, there's no doubt at all that the mental health of some students have been affected. But interestingly, a letter published by the DFE today is suggesting that maybe the impact is more on children and youngsters with existing emotional wellbeing, mental health needs and or disabilities and or SEN needs there. And that there's some emerging evidence that suggests there might actually be a resilience building factor in some other youngsters for the reasons we've just discussed, which is they've got through it and they've grown in confidence and strength as a result. Because of course, for some youngsters, you know, that break not being in school has been a benefit. For others, it's been a real hit on emotional wellbeing and mental health. The agencies are working together, and I just want to mention here one particular organisation that works a lot with young people. That's Youthline. Now, Youthline have done a lot of online counselling, as you would expect during the course of the pandemic. They've seen an increase in, you know, the demand and need for their services. As part of the council's ambitious redevelopment plans for Cooper's Hillside, they've actually moved to Portman Close, which they say has been a real benefit to them because they've got bigger rooms at Portman Close, which means as well as doing, you know, the online virtual counselling and support, they've been able to do face-to-face meetings because they've got bigger rooms and more space. So they're also in a position where they're actually currently recruiting more counsellors. So, you know, that's one example of an organisation dealing with the more low-level work. Schools are very much building emotional resilience, positive mental health and emotional wellbeing into their recovery plans. So if you look at a lot of the PSHE teaching, that's the personal, social, emotional support in schools, there's quite a lot about actually, you know, promoting your own emotional wellbeing. Department for Education, conscious of this and building on, you know, emerging evidence. And I think, Chair, it's too early to know exactly what the impact is. We're running up mental health training, and East Berkshire working together to train mental health workers. We always need more resources. This was the case before the pandemic. It's very much the case now. And just a couple of other things that I think we need to flag. You know, parents do have the right to home educate their youngsters. And what we have seen is an additional 15 children being home educated on this time last year. Now, it is a preference and a right for families to do that, but I just flag that we need to understand, reach out to and do such visits as we can with families, just to understand and make sure that everything is as it should be. And it's not just children. I think what lockdown has done is it's highlighted that quite often emotional wellbeing and mental health issues are not just restricted to youngsters. You know, we're moving into a time of, shall we say, employment uncertainty, the likes of Bracknell Forest has not seen for some time. Also, families going through lockdown, that sort of slightly more restrictive lifestyle. In fact, I mean, some of the issues that potentially present in families were covered in the last item. You know, domestic abuse, issues in the home. I think we're very conscious. It's not just the mental health and emotional well-being of children, it's actually the whole family. So from an education perspective, that's the kind of list of things we're working on. And Councillor Birch, I think over to you now, really, on that one.
No.
Thank you. From the Health and Wellbeing Board perspective, the Health and Wellbeing Board hasn't met since the end of February. But before then, one of the priorities of the Health and Wellbeing Board was children's mental health. And you'll know that it's a key priority in the Council's overall health and wellbeing strategy. That said, one of the particularly key areas for me, and Gareth will support this, is I've spent a few years spending close attention on our CAMS organisation, Children Mental Health Service, which is, and I'm going to use a word that's all of a sudden become very apropos, the CAMS service is divided into 4 tiers. And those 4 tiers are at tier 1 and 2 level. That's happening in the schools. And schools can commission in their own services, and we, the authority, can assist them in commissioning services. Gareth mentioned the online service being provided. I'd also remind members that we were an early adopter of Couth, one of the services for people with mobile phones, youngsters that could engage with their peer groups in a safe environment and access counsellors in a safe way. And that over the last few years has been very successful. And that form of engagement with young people has blossomed across East Berkshire. So we were quite an early adopter in that respect. That said, the significant issue we had before COVID was waiting times for assessments for things like autism, waiting times for assessments for ADHD and things like that. And they were quite horrific. And I'm not exaggerating, I've used those words before, and members know that, because they were 2 years to get an assessment for an autistic spectrum disorder assessment. And unfortunately, COVID hasn't assisted, because one of the major issues that our colleagues have in our mental health services for young people is capacity. How many people do they have that are qualified to support young people with mental health issues? And that, of course, during COVID has been exacerbated, because not all their staff have been able to engage. But one of the things that has been happening, our CCG partners have been working hard, and our council support people have been working hard to engage more with digital assessments. So a lot more has been going on where practitioners have been able to access and do acceptable assessments online. And in fact, the CCG has put additional funding, as has the government, into that area. And in fact, we've had going into the children's mental health support services since the beginning of the year, we've had an additional 747,000 going into that, which has also gone on assisting the capacity issue by engaging contractors to come in and support and help with that reducing of the waiting list. Reason for that waiting list thing is, one of the things that's happening is we've seen an increase in the number of referrals of young people into mental health services. We've got a number already in the system. And of course, one of the things that determines capacity and workload is how many are being discharged. The number of young people being discharged from our health practitioners is not high. And that is an area of focus for our CCG practitioners, and they are at what's called tier 2/3 level of that CAMS area. And that's where GPs get involved in referrals to appropriate psychiatric care and so on and so forth, for psychiatric assessments and so forth. And so part of the new thinking going forward is, how can we increase the discharge level safely, so that the numbers coming into the system can be managed. The other element of that is, and I was pleased to see in a recent report, that the focus is going to be more on early intervention of support, trying to support people, young people, preschool even, you'll be interested to note, young people that are demonstrating signs of ADHD or autism or other similar, and getting in early to see if they can, with a small amount of assistance, can be helped away from then coming into the critical system later on. And there's, I'm pleased to say that the focusing now of our commissioners is into looking at that as well. The other interesting thing, if you're looking, can I make a recommendation here? If you're looking for a really excellent piece of work on the effect on mental health of young people during COVID-19, can I recommend all members go and look up the Bernardo's report called In Our Own Words. It is exceptional, and I really do recommend it to members because it looks at those key areas that youngsters are, young people are angsting most about and it's an assessment done of the counsellors and support workers as well as the young people. And it cites things like a 70% increase in those that are engaged with them, I hasten to add, about anxiety. Another increase, 50% increase in sleep dysregulation. Now, that's a really important thing when it comes to learning. If you get a good night's sleep and a good meal in the morning, you're more likely to engage with the educational process. If you are having dysfunctional sleeping patterns, it has an adverse effect on your education and learning. It also has an adverse effect on your interface with your peer group and your friends. So it's have a read of this Bernardo's report. I really do recommend it. There's increase in stress for young people, increase in depression. And of course, if mum and dad are feeling it, guess what? Right? They are more likely to suffer from what's called vicarious trauma. They start to share and own somebody else's trauma, and that if they're all lumped together in the same household, has a greater effect than if previously they would be able to go out, as Gareth said, mix in their social peer group, have a chat with a friend whose mum and dad were also, oh yeah, okay, no problems. So,
sorry, Dale, just to repeat, that was called In Our Own Work.
It's called, gone to the Bernardo site. It's their mental health and COVID-19 report, and it's called In Our Own Words. Words. Absolutely recommend it to you. So that's a really interesting and important piece, but the main issue is capacity, and COVID has had the same effect on our mental health colleagues and our commissioning colleagues as it has across the board. And can I say, adding to Gareth's earlier comments, that there have been some exceptional pieces of work done to continue and maintain the level of support that we have been able to do. And I'd like to express my thanks to the CCG and all our health partners, particularly our mental health partners, in maintaining a service through what have been incredibly difficult times.
Okay, thank you, Dale. Gareth, can we open it up to questions at this point on this particular aspect of the questions? I've got, first of all, Councillor Badigo.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Dale, for the presentation and the update. My question is, I'm trying to, I hear a lot of anecdotal evidence about what we think is happening in schools, what we think is happening in local. And I also speak to students, and they tell me pretty much what they're going through and stuff like that. And what I would love to have is it's a survey or data to back up what I'm hearing. I think it is something that we can do locally, so we have a good picture of what is going on, and it is the time with that knowledge that we can actually do something. We don't have to wait until the crisis is over, because then it will be too late. So is there anything available data-wise?
Could I come in on that?
Yes, please.
You're talking about survey data as it relates to our young people. I think the first thing to say is, notwithstanding the number of interim reports and letters that come out, it is too early to definitively understand what the long-term impact on emotional wellbeing and mental health is. We know what we're dealing with in our schools at the moment, and teachers are day-to-day dealing with the direct consequences of lockdown on the emotional wellbeing of a group of students. In terms of collecting data locally, to do a proper survey, there is neither the resource or the capacity, or I think it would be appropriate to go into our schools to do that at the moment. But what is happening on a more national basis with a local twist that will help us is the government is doing that work at the moment. As I say today, some interim findings have been published by DFE on that. But absolutely, Michael, as we get more understanding of the impact of COVID, both positive and negative on the emotional wellbeing and mental health of young people, we can use that to further inform service development and needs. But to reassure you, at the moment, where resource is needed, work is being done to put it in with the resources that are available. I think Dale has given us a really good overview of the work the CCG is doing, the Berkshire Healthcare Trust, other health professionals. DFE is actually training mentors in schools to provide some local support. So there's a huge amount of practical work going on. My suggestion would be, Michael, the time to pull together numbers on the impact will be as we move through the end of this winter, hopefully, you know, this big COVID second wave, to possibly this time next year, where we can more broadly work with our schools to understand a year on what that impact has looked like, what resource has been used and where it's needed. I have no doubt it will show up some interesting information, but I would be wary, really wary of using data collection at the moment based on where schools are to actually inform what we do, you know, going forward in a more strategic way, because locally within schools, we're trying to get the resources where we need it. And Dale made another good point, which I think is really, really important, is because we don't run schools, we're reliant on schools providing information, and we have two routes of doing that. The first is through the work of our attached advisors, as well as looking at how standards, the curriculum and the work's being taught, are also getting a feeling for how schools are coping with this. And secondly, from the sort of health data that will come out in terms of referrals, waiting times, access. I've mentioned already the work the Youth Line does, and we'll get stats through from that as well. So there's a rich amount of information we can use. But Michael, we're here we are, 6 weeks is it into the new term, and we are working on almost a triage basis day by day, just to ensure that children are in school, getting an education, that if they've been in contact with someone that's tested positive for COVID, that actually we are making sure that they are safe. I think we need to just step back a little bit, remember that schools are working, you know, together and on the basis for their students. And when the opportunity arises, to seek to use government data available and to, by consent, work with schools at an appropriate time to get that. It really is a challenging situation. I'm not convinced that a huge amount is being missed, but I'm also not convinced we're in the right position yet to get some of that, you know, more statistical data longer term. I think Dale wants to come in at this point as well.
Could I just support Gareth in the comment there? But Michael, I share your concerns as well about the feeling that have we got A, the right data, and B, enough data to inform our future actions and to make sure we can get it as right as possible. Now, one of the things that we don't have is sufficient data over time in a granularity that would be useful for decision making. We can probably get something that might give a headline, right? But that's not what I want, and I absolutely hope that's not what anybody else wants. Because one of the things we're going to have to look at, we have to look at the stratification of the data that we're going to be needing. And we're going to have to look at young people and get statistics about those with existing health difficulties. They will be responding differently and need a different level and produce a different set of criteria moving forward. Likewise, BAME children and young people, right? We will need to look at and granularize that data in a specific way to better inform our future commissioning. Poverty, what effect are some of our areas of deprivation in terms of the effect on the emotional and mental health well-being of young people, particularly when mum and dad are kicking off about money or the lack thereof. The other area that I know we're all going to be keen on, what about those that are transiting out of education into employment? You know, what's the effect on them? Because they're just setting out and then all of a sudden they're furloughed, or where they were going doesn't exist anymore. We need to look and understand about that area between NEET and employed. Some of the other things, special education needs, we have to be looking at, because there's not just ADHD and autism, there's things like agoraphobia and so on and so forth. We have to actually be able to classify and segment into those areas when we then, and of course young carers, for goodness sake, and the list goes on in terms of I noticed in the Bernardo's submission a really heart-wrenching quote that said, and I'll paraphrase it, that outside the school all the parents were coming to pick up their kids. I'm a care leaver. And
yes, sorry, my question.
All those stratifications of data need to be first of all identified, and then the necessary data and information work. Now, the good news is we know that. And the good news is that we're coming together under the PLACE agenda. All our health partners are coming together under the PLACE agenda, where we're going to look at whole population health and mental health management. So again, I'm making a plug for when those workshops come up for getting members actively engaged in that.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Sorry, I wanted to comment there, but I think a lot of time was spent just on the health data, which is not really one of the big things I'm after. Because yes, I understand that we have to, with the health data, mental health data, that is going to be a long time thing. But the area I want to really focus on is the impact on tech, for example, things that we can do now, we can affect now, right? I've heard stories like a parent using their mobile phone to download PDF and printing, or handwriting homework on a piece of paper to distribute, right? This is the UK in 2020, right? A parent is having to use a pen to copy things from an internet to distribute paper. That is unacceptable. Now, we need to have a
wait a minute, Michael, let me stop.
Yeah.
Sign into speech mode and we're in questioning and we've got to okay, I think we've got the point you're making.
Michael, sorry, Chair, Michael.
Very briefly, Gareth.
Let me be very, very clear that our schools have put in place strategies to ensure that if at home, pupils can access work. You were talking about emotional wellbeing, mental health at the start of this. One of the key things to help promote positive mental health is what our schools are doing day in, day at the moment, which is to try and make the learning experience in our schools as normal as possible, to allow as good social interactions as possible in a safe way, but to try and ensure that the normality that is there, which helps. There'll be lots of time to go down some of these other avenues, but for the moment, this is a day-to-day process to ensure that as many children as possible feel supported and able to learn in the school environment. As things move on, and who knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks, things can get a little more sophisticated. The health data is vital because that's how it links together. But fundamentally, Michael, at this point in time, it's a day-to-day supportive existence. I believe, Chair, that Mary has a question.
Yeah, she does. She's next.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it reflects really on something Gareth said, and that was you referred to the mentors that are being trained up and employed by the government. And I was wondering, I mean, with capacity, with people who have actually sort of not been engaged, and with children with mental health issues who need to talk to people and have more of a one-to-one, when are they likely to come into the schools, and how do we have to apply, or how will they be allocated, please?
I think it's one of these government initiatives that's working through. I mean, I think first of all, this term is about understanding the parameters around this. But my belief and understanding is that in terms of practical application, the training and the work will start in the spring term. Before the government mentors come in, I should also say, and I think Councillor Templeton, you're probably aware of this, that actually we have had some sort of resource and some learning in schools around promoting positive mental health. I think the DFE additional capacity and support is great, but my hope is to make this sustainable. We'll do what we've done on other things, which is train the trainer. But I believe that this programme is due to start out in schools in the spring term, and we're following that programme closely to make sure that we get the very best from it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dale. Mary, was that satisfying for you in terms of your question? Okay.
You're on mute is the most popular expression of the year, but there we go, Chair.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can we move on to the exam one?
Sorry, we've got 3 other items on the, if we can quickly run through those, I'm sure it's exams.
Yes, I mean, the next question is, so, yes, we do have, as Baldrick was saying, a cunning plan for exams now, according to the Secretary of State, and that is that GCSE and A-levels will take place next summer, but they will start later, I believe early June, go through to early July. And I heard an interview with the interim head of Ofqual, Dame Glenys Stacey, this morning, who says this is going to give an additional 8% learning time. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because, of course, there are huge concerns which are not going to help with the emotional wellbeing and mental health of some of our youngsters if they have to self-isolate or they find that their year group is closed for a period of time because of COVID. Because she has to take her steer in as head of Ofqual from the Secretary of State about exams next year. And what at the moment the government is saying is that all children will be told the whole curriculum, because long term that means when they move on to the next stages in life, they'll have the breadth of knowledge to be successful. But of course, the issue is that if they're missing school time, even if they get the extra 8% before the exam starts, how fair will an exam be? So it's been identified when they will take place. This is in England because Scotland's decided to do its own thing. But, you know, watch this space. This is October. I think we just see how play out. But at this point in time, GCSEs and A-levels will take place. But if I was a young person at the moment, as I think the class of 2019-20 will find out, it might be a pretty good idea to keep doing my coursework as conscientiously as possible and take my mock exams very seriously, because who knows?
Okay.
Plans to have exams, but who knows? So I think that's the next question. Then the last...
Okay, back on to the budgets.
Yes, on to the budgets. Of course, you see, the government gives most of its money directly to schools. We have, through the Schools Forum, only very limited say on funding that goes to school. And as you know, as a council, to compensate for the provision of new places and things like that, we have actually put additional resources locally in and do support a strong school improvement function. But DfE have asked schools to claim for COVID-related costs. There are some quite narrow parameters, and they will work directly with schools. They have not guaranteed all costs will be covered. So I hope that when our head teachers talk to Robert Halfon, that they will make the point very clearly that actually the cost of COVID is wider than the narrow definition that has been given. You know, I mentioned earlier a school asking, you know, local business for support around, you know, the provision of laptops. That's because with everyone working at home, the deals in brackets available on laptops are not as good as they were for schools to purchase. One of the biggest hits has actually been the additional cost of cleaning in schools. Some of it's covered, but there's a huge cost associated with PPE. Where also we are concerned about funding is, of course, schools are not opening their facilities to outside organisations. And, you know, the difficulty here, Chair, is that they were encouraged to let out premises, and it's an important source of income, you know, to support teaching and learning in schools. And at the moment, that's not something that they'll be reimbursed with, but it can be a significant sum of money, you know, because you often have regular bookings through the autumn. And for those of us outside this remit of town or parish councillors, we will also know the impact, of course, you know, COVID has had on the ability to, you know, allow community groups to use those facilities. So what happens next? I think we've got to keep pushing the DfE. We do raise it as an LA on a daily basis when we have calls about the costs of this. You know, I mean, even day-to-day PPE costs in schools, we try to help, but, you know, youngsters are not brilliant at holding on to their face coverings. And it's not a great idea if someone drops their face covering to expect them to pick it up and reuse it. So schools are, you know, having to provide those, despite the fact regularly parents are asked to make sure they've got them. So, yeah, they throughout lockdown, schools incurred costs. They did share resources. There is additional money going in overall to schools. Whether it will cover the full costs of COVID, I'm not certain, but I think we've just got to keep asking on that one. But
okay, Gareth.
it has fun. And the final one is about testing. Oh dear, where do we start? So testing, of course, is based on when students have symptoms or whether there's close contact, and likewise goes for teachers. We are doing what we can to ensure that teachers and those that most need it have access to testing locally, as if we have a localised lockdown in the school, clearly testing and appropriate self-isolation is the way to get schools up and running. It's not just for older children, of course, because when we got back to school, as was entirely predictable, you get the first week back cough and cold when the whole of Bracknell seemed to be coughing, spluttering, as generally happens when you know, children get together. I think things are settling down now. There's more of a regular path, but as with all of these things, as testing capacity increases, demand increases. So what we try to do is make sure that you know, testing is as rapid and as efficient as possible to minimise closure time in schools. And I think that the last bit was a really interesting one. So if I've got the question here, it was, what plans are in place if anyone fails to portray the majority? Well, when I first read this, of course, it was somewhat, you need to do it or we'll get a little bit upset. And to be honest with you, you know, where it became necessary, we ensured that certain agencies visited people just to remind them that self-isolating does actually mean staying at home. And so that when somebody knocks on the door and expects you to answer, that you need to be there. What has, of course, changed since is that there now is a significant financial penalty if you're not there when someone knocks on your door. So there is actually a fairly strong incentive. But I have to say, overall, there have been high levels of compliance because we have had hundreds of youngsters who've had to self-isolate for 2 weeks. If you remember, we had that incident at the start of the term. And I have to say, to a credit, those youngsters and their families have followed the rules, but we are going to go after, for the good of, you know, our community, those who flout those rules, because actually self-isolating however tough and difficult it is hugely important in reducing the impact on others. And if you think that because of an initial outbreak that we had well over 100 youngsters in critical school years, you know, in years where actually it really matters, having to self-isolate for the first 2 weeks of school, you know, that's a huge amount of lost teaching time.
Yeah.
Remember, the school year doesn't go right the way through to July because of exams. So we'll do what we can. But can I just finish by thanking a number of people? Can I just thank all our teachers, teaching assistants, our governors, Rachel and everyone at the local authority, from our perspective, who have worked tirelessly from, you know, the time before lockdown till now. You know, this is unprecedented for our schools, but the way they've all worked together, the humour, the support they've mutually given between academies and local authority schools. And if Chair, I can say one thing. If we can keep those strong working relationships together between all our schools, the biggest beneficiaries will be our pupils, who will have opportunities and support based on good practice, shared and understood, which I hope will stand them in good stead for years to come. And we'll look back and say, it was horrific, it was horrible, it was challenging, but some good came from it.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. There's a question from Councillor Virgo.
Okay, because I know we're pushing time, Gareth. One thing which I don't quite understand is the exam problem, and I understand it's a national thing, but maybe we could influence. But what I do understand that if the students haven't had enough learning, then that becomes problematic. But I don't quite understand why we can't do exams, say, on a weekend with social distancing. Because exams are so important to these students in a way, because we built this system up. And, you know, that came from a teacher. I don't quite understand it, because he said we could easily have done this at weekends, frankly.
Well, I think to be absolutely blunt, and if I stand up for the teachers here, there are a number of things that we need to be very clear about. First of all, with very, very few exceptions, examinations nationally need to be taken in the same place at the same time under strict, tight exam conditions. The prevalence of technology and sadly the ability for a very, very small minority to effectively cheat or game the system for their personal advantage means that you have to be very clear about that. It was not practical during last academic year to hold exams, and certainly not to hold them at the weekends, because the capacity did not exist to do it. Going forward, the government sets the timetable for exams with, you know, Ofqual gives a commitment to the government that they will be delivered. We will, you know, and the process that follows, that is an absolutely national issue. Locally, what I know our teachers are doing is doing what I'm saying now, is they're advocating that any system of examination that goes in next summer is fair to all children. And here's the dilemma, Tony. If you have very engaged parents that no matter what hits you during the course of the academic year, you don't lose that motivation, you don't lose their impetus. If you're self-isolating or missing school times, great. If you've got parents that have some knowledge, great. But if you are in a family where none of those things happen, where access to technology is sporadic, where actually you need that little bit of extra helping hand and support, if you're hit by a self-isolation or a school closure for a period of time, you are not in year 11 or 13 going to make up that time. So where my concern is, on behalf of our youngsters, is what does a fair examination in the summer of 2021 look like? Do you have considerably more choice in the questions that you can answer? Because if you remember in most exams, I think we can probably all remember back to some exams where we had the compulsory bits at the start, and then we had, you know, optional questions. Do you increase the number of optional questions? You can do that, but then Tony, the issue is the government turns around at the moment and says, oh, but that means you're not going to teach the whole curriculum. So I think we're at the first stage of guidance. The Secretary of State has said exams will take place. I think there is a huge debate to be had as to how, when that actually happens. I just reflect on the fact, with all things COVID related, what seems to be guidance set in stone in September, by October changes. And I don't think the education side of this is so. Yes, exams can be held at weekends in some settings, but you have to think about the fact that examinations are a national scheme, national system, and it has to be managed and maintained in that way. And
I do, but I do think, Gareth, that we need to push this, because to students going to university or wherever they're going, to delay this for a year is a disaster from everyone's point of view.
It's a very live debate. You make some interesting points. My view is that I'm making a very strong point, and will do, no doubt, to Robert Halfon and to about the pressures facing the exam system. Chair, over to you. I think there's some more questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's one more question on this from Jill.
And then I think you got Trish, is it?
No, not showing up on mine.
No, it has gone down. Jill.
Thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you for that. I actually am quite passionate about this exam situation. I personally think we should trust teachers, and I think now they should make the decision that they should be fair across the board. They made such a mess of this in the summer that I think they, right, we're going to have mock exams, you're going to do coursework, and we're going to do it on that. I cannot see how it can be fair. Now I'm going to, I'd like your view on that. And the other thing about it is, Chair, I would quite like to write to central government and say, I think they need to start trusting the teachers. I think they need to actually think long term and not keep changing things, and actually have a real strategy, because I think our youngsters need it. They need certainty.
Keep it to a question?
So my question is, what do you think, Gareth, about the fact that we could actually suggest this? What do you think about it? Just having mocks and just having coursework for this next year?
Can we have a brief answer, Gareth, please?
I think that we have to make sure that whatever system is used to assess the achievements of our youngsters next summer is fair and consistent and sets them up well for the future journey. Whether that is entirely examination based or whether it actually has elements of greater emphasis on teacher assessment is important. But what I'll say this is, it's not sustainable for anybody, be it the students or others, to have a situation that we had this summer. I raged and ranted because this rogue algorithm, I think, really discredited the idea of how grades, were calculated. But what struck me is you couldn't have year on year the grade inflation that you had. Youngsters work hard, achieve hard, but I don't want them to look back on the class of 2020 and or 2021 and say, well, of course, that was just teacher assessment. Examinations have a place. I think the debate at the moment that Glenys Stacey started today was to say, what does a fair assessment and examination look like next summer? I think we need exams. I think they need to be delivered because it's the best way of assessing the level students have got to, but they have to be fair. And we're in October, and we don't need to decide, frankly, how they are delivered until early next year. I think let's leave the experts to come back with something that will be fair, that won't disadvantage students, but will at the same time give a clear incentive for teachers to teach the broad base of the curriculum. If you ask me what's going to happen, I think there will be some sort of a hybrid system. There'll be greater choice. There will need to be, if there be extensive self-isolation and or other issues, there will need to be, I think, a category of special circumstance for discussion, which is why I say teachers doing a great job, assess pupils' work, put effort into mock exams, so the body of evidence is there to back up what might or might not happen in next summer. But I do think, Jill, there is a place for exams, and I do think we've got to get that right, because I think ultimately that's how you grade and relate year on year attainment by students.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll bring this item, I think.
You got Michael, is that?
No, I'm going to bring it to a conclusion now.
Okay, thank you.
Can I thank you for this evening? Can I thank Councillor Birch for coming? And I think we've certainly had a very good overview, some scrutiny. And I hope if any parents are watching this as a public vision, that they can see the concern and the answers. And I think we all understand how difficult it must be for teachers, for social workers, everybody at the moment. And And I thank you for actually opening some of the thought processes that we need to think about and be aware about. Probably subconsciously, we've already done it, but you've highlighted it and brought it.
Yeah.
I think you've already made a good tag in. You've called them the class of COVID for the future. So that one doesn't stick. But,
well, I'm very proud of them, actually.
Yeah.
I think we should be proud of this group of youngsters.
Absolutely.
You know, they're amazing people. You know,
they are dedicated.
They've lived through things that we won't have done for education. And, you know, I think they'll come out of it stronger. And I think, you know, good luck to all of them. We'll work with them and support them.
Well, thanks very much indeed on behalf of all the members.
Yeah, here.
Can we therefore move on to, sorry, Tony, was it? Your name's come up. Tony Virgo,
I'm here. Yes.
What's that about?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, you're back on. Are you? We're just finishing. We've finished item 7. We're moving on to item 8.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. Your picture's up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just. I don't know.
Okay, so we move on to item 8, the care leavers review. Now, I don't know about other members, but you would have got or should have had a report this morning. I got it this morning. You may have got it sooner. That leads in, and I'm sure, Jill, if I can ask you to introduce this, because we've actually got the report in the papers, but then this other supplementary report came along. So do you want to just the report from the panel?
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. I actually am very proud of this review because I wanted the outcome to be very readable, more accessible. So if you look at the actual report, the Care Leavers Review, you'll see that the recommendations are on the front page. And I think that this is perhaps a format that we can take on board. And so we only have 5 recommendations so that it's more manageable. It is actually outcome-based. If you've got the correct one, it's actually got dates on every single recommendation. You know, I thank everybody that took part, that's officers and all the members, because I think really it was a really good job. It was very long. It started very early in the morning, went on very late at night because it was done in a day. But I really feel that we really went into it in the right depth. The care leavers were very honest with us, which Councillor Brossard in this, he's got a lovely quote saying that they were the most important part, and it's true. They really told us what was happening. And so the recommendations are really looking at the housing allocation policy because we found there was a little bit of an anomaly there. The fact that if the child in looked after child was actually staying in a foster family, they were bumped up the housing allocation, but if they were living somewhere else, they weren't. So we wanted it to be a level playing field. And the life skills and money management, although it's very good, we felt it could be looked at again. The staying put policy needed just to be a little bit simpler. I mean, it was a very long and it was very difficult to actually find your way through. And the protocol between social care team and housing team about the needs of homeless young people to be reviewed. And also the last one was giving the care leavers a chance to actually be celebrated for their achievements, because we do that for children that are looked after, but we actually never did anything like that for the care leavers. And they actually mentioned this, and I thought that was really a lovely thing to do. So I hope you all found it very interesting. It's going to go to the executive, which is obviously very few weeks' time. So I actually would like you to endorse the fact that we're going to go to the executive, and there's a paper we've got putting it all together and saying what we're going to do. Whether, Chairman, you want me to do anything more?
No, thank Thanks, Jill. I hope members have had a chance to read it. Importantly, of the officers is there in the report there, so they've worked very closely and helped you. And I think to thank all the panel members.
I think so. The one thing that came out is that in 6 months' time, we'd like to come back. And in the meantime, we'd like a working group to look at the COVID, how the care leavers coped during COVID. And that actually came out when we worked with the officers afterwards, just recently. And we were talking about the ramifications, because with all of us, we found it very difficult in COVID on our own. And some of these youngsters, literally as COVID started, as the lockdown, they were then in their accommodation on their own for the very first time. So we want to actually have a working group looking at how they've coped and how they're coping at the moment. So that's a recommendation that we're going to take to the executive.
Okay.
That's an extra thing.
Thank you. Questions? I only have one question. I'm being nudged in the side about our time. Tony, you've got a quick question?
Just a quick question, Mr. Chairman. Jill, I thought it was a great report, actually, if I may say so. But there was one thing that really interests me was, I suppose, some of the kids there going to further educational university, and that seemed to be a bit of a problem. And I just wondered what you felt, whether that was because they felt they couldn't do that, or they didn't have enough help, or they just wanted to earn money. I don't know.
No, what it was there was a problem, and actually that was one of the recommendations, that we would actually facilitate working with higher educational establishments better. Now, Portsmouth do a brilliant, an absolute brilliant day where they actually have children that are looked after actually invited along, because it was almost like a barrier for some of them. They felt going along when they had lots of families being shown round, and it was difficult for them. They felt perhaps they didn't quite meet the criteria, or it was going to be too difficult to do. So it was sort of breaking down those barriers and making it more accessible to them. So it was that sort of area. And
we need to improve.
Yes. And so Portsmouth was actually leading light in this. So we just were hoping that we could perhaps foster more of that.
Okay, thanks, Jill.
Thank you,
Jill. Are there any members that are opposed to the recommendations at all in the report? I'm pleased to say there's not. So I'm taking it that we're all supporting the recommendations.
Yes, yes, Chairman. Yes.
The Overview and Scrutiny Commission.
Chairman. Yes.
Sorry, Michael, did you want to say something? Mike Brossard?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes, can I, Chairman? Can I endorse what actually Jill said? It really was I think it was a very interesting presentation that took place, a very interesting debate. Also, what I think is important is to recognise the contribution by democratic services in the form of Louise Connolly in actually bringing together to produce what I thought was an excellent report, which I read this afternoon with the endorsements that were added. I thought it was something that I took pleasure from, and I actually thought it was very, very productive, supportive presentation and discussion. And Jill, I think, was very good. Jill, in some ways, was the glue that brought it all together. So I enjoyed that participation. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Okay. Can I just say one thing, Chair? The fact is, the one learning aspect we've had from it is because of COVID, things had to be drawn out. So we had to go back and work together with the officers again. And actually, a little bit of time, I wouldn't say as much time, but sometimes between producing a report and then going back was useful, because out of it, we've got the idea of the working group, and the officers then had time to put timescales so that we had proper outcomes that we could actually assess in 6 months' time. But the one thing that I've learned through this is we had a whole day review. So it started at 9 o'clock in the morning and went on till 9 o'clock at night, and that is too long. We must always make it shorter. So other than that, I commend it to everyone as a way of working.
Thank you, Jill. Okay, we're moving on now to item 9, which is the work programme from 2019 to 2023, as it's headed. I'm sure that members will have read the report and understood the change in circumstances and therefore the timetable with the subject matters. Kevin, do you want to come in? Anything to add?
Chair, given the lateness of the hour, perhaps we can just take the report as read. The only things I would draw members' attention to would be 5.4, which is the schedule of meetings, and just showing that we're back on track. And at 5.9, the proposed replanning of work, which is also shown in Appendix A. And then on pages 71 to 75, having the work update. So, Chair, if you take the report as read, and it's just those two elements that we need to sort out, one, just agree the programme going forward, and then it will be just Chairman's reports.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Can I just say and just point out to members, of course, with all of the COVID operations and staff, of course, being moved to do other matters, apart from support the ONS Commission and its panels, because that's had an impact on the degree of work that's been able to be accomplished. But I think if I can say thank you to everybody in your department, and indeed the ladies who are supporting this evening in the background, who of course we don't see. But I'll take any questions from any member that's got a query on the work programme or disagrees with it. Are there any? The only one, Jill, are you off or you muted? No, you're not muted.
It's me, it's Mary.
Oh, sorry, Mary.
All these work programmes involve members getting involved. So will you please put out when the meetings are by whoever's running them, and as soon as possible, so we can book them all in and see which ones we out. Was very, very good, but we need more active members taking place and taking part in order to be as sort of a bigger spectrum of input as possible. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, we'll certainly take that on board. Any other comments? No? Then I'll take it we're accepting item 9. There's 3 recommendations there that you will have seen. And there's nobody else wishing to speak. Can I therefore thank everybody for their attendance this evening? I know it's been a long evening, but I think the subject matter alone is so important to our daily lives, really. And it's just fascinating when you do get this opportunity to delve and to take an overview or scrutinise some of the things that perhaps aren't quite so obvious until you're talking to people who have to deal with it in depth on a daily by hour basis. So thank you for everybody's attendance. And I'll close the meeting.
Thank you.
Good night, Mr. Chairman. Well done.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Right, Chairman.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.